with Admiral Mike Mullen. It's my privilege to be sitting here with the Admiral, who when I covered him, I would call him Admiral Mullen. I'm still trying to work my way to Mike. Maybe Admiral Mike just as a transition, which makes it sound like a kid's show on Saturday morning, the Admiral Mike Show. We're going to jump right in, but I don't think he needs any introduction. But I'll just say this: as you know, he's been right at the center of all of the tumult of the past 12 years, 13 years or so. He was, of course, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, one of the only Navy guys ever to get that job, in fact. Served as the chief military advisor to two presidents, President Bush, President Obama, the only two presidents of the post 9/11 era. Before that, he ran the United States Navy, which sounds impressive to me. What do you do? I run the Navy. It's a little organization, and I think this is true. And I think this is a bipartisan statement, that there are very few military leaders who've been considered as effective as Mike has been, really in the post-World War II era. And so it's great that you could come out to Aspen and talk to us. So let's just go right at it. The whole theme of this 10th Anniversary Ideas Festival is to sort of cast ahead 10 years, 2024. But the odd thing about the subject area that we're going to focus on, sort of the U.S. And the wars of the Middle East and the challenges that we've seen from that belt stretching from Tunisia and Libya on one side to Pakistan and Afghanistan on the other, is that history is happening right now, which makes it harder to predict in a way, because everything's in motion. Just in the last couple of weeks, we've seen almost a meta-historical event, the de facto erasure of the post-World War I order. ISIS, the Al-Qaeda affiliate that's now rampaging both through Syria and Iraq, literally erased the line separating Syria and Iraq, the line drawn by British and French diplomats in 1916. So if you can, maybe take a minute or two and frame out what you think is going on, if this is in fact as historical as it seems. And the most important question, of course, is, what does this mean for American national security? We seem to be at a very, very dangerous moment.
I agree. I think we're at a very dangerous moment, and I'm reluctant to use the term inflection point per se, because I think history, as you said, is still being written, and it's difficult to know how significant and how big this time is. When you talk about 100 years later, and Michael Oren was up here a couple days ago, and he talked about that order which got established 100 years later, and 100 years was pretty good in terms of the time frame that it's covered, and with some modicum of stability over that period of time. I'm not sure that's very satisfying given the turmoil that we're living in right now. Years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I was in Jordan and I'm here with my wife Deborah, and we will be married 44 years on the 12th of July, and I wouldn't be here without her. So that partnership has been critical to that career you talked about. But we have an Arabist ambassador by the name of Hale, who I asked about 10 years ago what should I read about the Middle East, and he said, read Fromkin's book, Peace to End All Peace. It is a book that made my head hurt in trying to understand it, but there were a couple of things that really jumped out. And this is maybe 2005 or 2006 in Iraq. The significance of the decisions that were made 100 years ago and the impact that they were having right now. And then that really motivated me to try to do as much as I could to get the decisions we make right now. We make now, get those right because of the potential implications, first of all. Secondly, how many bad decisions Winston Churchill could make in rapid succession, who was a remarkable leader, even though he was younger, and again, mindful of both the power and the importance of leadership in any kind of situation. And then it fasts forward to where we are right now, as you indicated, the line being physically erased just the other day. When I came in as chairman, and I try to drive myself from a strategic perspective, so I have some idea where we're going, what everybody wants to do, and then how do I, whether I'm running the Navy or as chairman, how does the military fit into that? One of the things I put together was a sort of a priority list, and the first priority list was to, in as much as I could do in the military, impact stability in the Middle East. And I focused, that was my top priority. And obviously when I come in 2007, we're at the height of the surge. Iraq has been a disaster. It is turning around. We don't have enough resources in Afghanistan, and not insignificantly, we've got a pretty significant terrorist issue. So I've tried to focus my strategy on what I call sort of Tehran to Beirut, that belt, and how much could the military help in stabilizing that part of the world. And here it is, 7 years later almost, and it's still pretty unstable, and it dominates, I think it will dominate our national security policy for a long time into the future. And it must, my own view, it has to do that based on our interests. And our interests include our economic interests. I've spent a little time studying energy since I retired, and I'm sometimes taken back that somehow, because of the technology for shale and the additional oil we found, that we think we're near energy independence, and nothing could be further from the truth. We're in a lot better shape because we have an abundance of energy that we didn't have a few years ago, or even imagine a few years ago. But the price of a barrel of oil is going to be controlled by the Middle East for the next 10, 15, 20 years for sure. So there's a dependence there. There's clearly, I think, the most significant issue in this war today, what you read about this morning, is the terrorist threat that is emerging, or that is there and growing inside that belt that is now Iraq and Syria. We used to be very concerned about hundreds of terrorists. When we talk about Al-Qaeda presence in Afghanistan, it would be in the tens or maybe a couple hundred. It would be in the low hundreds, maybe low thousands in Iraq when that was going on. There are tens of thousands of jihadists right now in that belt. Now, they're not all in love with each other. A lot of them are killing each other as well, but it is a staggering number.
Do you assume that eventually jihadists who are killing each other, or Sunni jihadists who are killing Shia, eventually will come to the idea that, hey, maybe we should be killing Americans like our predecessors?
Well, I think there is resident, certainly in a significant portion of that group, the desire to kill Americans. They're obviously consumed right now with what's going on there, but certainly that is where they want to go. And so we're going to have to figure out how to address that. I was recently in London, and I almost didn't talk to a person in London that wasn't concerned about the British jihadists who are in that area. You've seen recently the first American suicide bomber. I know there's huge concern in France as well. So we can't do this alone, but I think we're all going to have to figure out how to continue to address that. And people ask me, there's a short-term, I'm not saying solution, but we've got to address this in the short term and the long term. And the long-term piece, as far as I'm concerned, has to do with figuring out a way to assist and support governments who have come out of oppression, who have nothing but young people with no future and no hope. And it is in that no hope scenario that so many young people put on suicide vests and become jihadists.
So let me ask you this, because as you all know, you were intimately involved in the planning of the bin Laden raid. We all know the famous photograph of you and Secretary Clinton and everyone else in the room. Immediately after the killing of bin Laden, and by the way, we're going to get to this because Admiral Mullen had the possibly unpleasant, possibly weirdly satisfying task of calling his Pakistani counterpart and telling him, "Oh, by the way, we just killed bin Laden in your country." So I want to talk about that moment. But what I'm curious.
Are you sure?
Yeah, no, I'm absolutely sure. I want every detail of that moment, actually. But what interests me so much about this moment is that after that, the president, in the days and weeks after that, not only the president, but Leon Panetta, other people said, Al-Qaeda's on its back heel, they're decimated, and there was a general feeling like we have rounded the key corner in the war on terror. You're describing a situation where we used to talk about hundreds of jihadists, now you're talking about thousands of jihadists. Are we losing now? And how did it come to pass that the Obama administration moved from that point to the point where we are today?
I don't want to slice this too thinly. What I both participated in, believed, and then has been discussed since that time is we really did decimate the leadership cell of Al-Qaeda. I would not say we have decimated Al-Qaeda more broadly. They are inspired by Zawahiri and others. Recently, when I asked, I was given a speech and I asked the audience if they knew anything about Boko Haram before they kidnapped these 300 young girls in Nigeria. And the answer was, never heard of them. This guy is as bad as bin Laden, the guy that's leading that group. There's another guy named Coney that's been running around Africa doing the same kind of thing, killing mostly young boys for 20 or 25 years. Equally as bad, possibly not as effective in terms of inspiration, which is the concern. But the links to Al-Qaeda, and some of them are strong and some of them are weak, some of them are only aspirational, are seemingly much more widespread now. And we will sort over time these tens of thousands who are now in this area in Iraq and Syria, who their allegiance is to, but they're a very, very bad group. We inspire them by who we are and what we believe in, and as we talked about just a minute ago, I think they'll eventually sort it to a point where they become a very, very serious threat to us.
Okay, but let me press you on this point, because we had a situation 2 years ago in which we didn't, or 3 years ago, we didn't have tens of thousands of jihadists literally erasing state borders in the Middle East. And now we have. This is a policy failure. I mean, axiomatically, a policy failure. What was the failure over the last 3 years in the Obama administration that brought us to this point?
I mean, I believe that back to what I said even in 2007 when I was chairman, that we've got to stay engaged in this region. And I think my friends in the region that I've talked to over the last couple of years, the question is very, very raw for them in terms of, are you going to be here for us? Ironically, I get the same question in Japan and in South Korea and in the other part of the world. And so I think that underpins what a lot of people in the regions believe about where we are headed. We are tired of war. Not incapable, by the way. I want to distinguish between being tired of war, which we are in the country and in the military, but not incapable of doing more if we're called to. This is the best force I had ever seen in over 43 years of being in the military. And I started in Vietnam. It's my belief we must stay engaged. I've not been a fan of the pivot strategy. I'm a basketball player. I grew up, with this in mind. When you pivot away from something and towards something. And I actually think the most important region in the world in the 21st century is the Asia-Pacific region, and that, in simple terms, it's because of the economics. And I think the U.S. and China bilateral relationship is the most important relationship in the world. That said, we've got to be able to do more than one thing. We can't just focus on that part of the world. We've got to stay engaged in the Middle East. We thought it was going well enough to possibly back away a little bit from Europe, per se, because my friends in Europe asked the same question, and Europe has to carry much more of a security load than they have. That obviously is not proven true with respect to Russia and Putin and what's going on there.
The interesting thing about the pivot to Asia is that the only people who don't believe we've pivoted to Asia are the Asians.
Yeah.
The Europeans and the Middle Easterners all believe it. But let me come back, in part because I have you trapped on this stage, I'm going to come back to the question,
Okay.
and you're a very diplomatic man. But
You mean about whether the Obama administration has failed?
oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, in fact, that is the
Did
question
you-
that I was going to ask again.
You haven't figured
He's
out?
so intuitive. It's unbelievable. All I have to do is ask
You-
4 times, and eventually, yeah.
And you haven't figured out I'm not going to answer
Well, no, but
that.
I'm going to rephrase it. I'm going to rephrase this in a way that you will be so astounded by my sophisticated rephrasing that you will be forced to come to grips with the question. And the rephrasing is this. So let's and frame it in the form of the pivot. President Obama, and this is completely understandable, President Obama was elected to do a certain very important thing. He was elected to get out of Iraq.
Yeah.
He understood what the mandate was from the people. George Bush, Barack Obama is president because his predecessor invaded one too many Muslim countries. So given that, I understand why he would be eager to leave that theater and hesitant to get into Syria. But take us back 3 years ago, if you will, or even actually, you know what, take us back to the Libya decision, because that was a moment in which, against maybe his better judgment or his instinct, he actually engaged in one of these post-Arab Spring conflicts, but then kind of left prematurely. Just take us inside the thinking, if you will, or try to explain to us how this administration maybe is making decisions about where to engage in the Middle East and where not to engage in the Middle East.
Well, first of all, I don't think I mean, certainly from my experience is you don't necessarily get a choice. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. And that's the Middle East. It just isn't going to go away. I was actually chairman when we signed the agreement with Iraq that was going to have all forces depart by the end of 2011. My own view of that is, and I watched President Bush do this in a number of areas. I mean, 2011 was a very significant date, but my own view was that President Bush, I wouldn't speak for him, but the approach was, we'll have a new president at that point, whoever that is, will have an opportunity to assess where whether we move forward coming out of Iraq or whether we do something else. And certainly that opportunity was there. And then I think you pay leadership to figure out, well, what's the best answer? And I go back to sort of this, you asked about Libya, the strategy piece for me, and Gates and I, it's known publicly, we weren't very supportive initially because we couldn't get the question answered, which is, where does this go? Not necessarily how does this end, although that's not a bad question, but just tell me where this goes. Tell me what happens next. And then briefly, and this is not insignificant because I think we have in ways emboldened Putin, but Putin basically abstained from the vote on Libya in the political environment in which it existed. And I think if you ask Putin today, he would say that did not include killing Gaddafi. And that his view was we overreached there given the mandate that came out of the UN at the time. And so that's a recent example of why should I trust the US specifically. We going into Libya, and we did, and once the president made the decision, certainly I and the military, we were all in with respect to that. And actually, I was delighted to see the Europeans lead. They led better than they thought they could, and they led for longer than they thought they could based on their military capability and their stores at the time, which was pretty significant. And I was delighted to see them do that because they had the capability, and we had a way, I thought, of bringing in Arab nations into this. And there were a lot of things that I think worked in the right direction. Many of you know I did the Benghazi Accountability Review Board for Secretary Clinton afterwards. I went back 18 months later to do this board, having been the military leader when we went into Libya, and I was astounded at that there was nobody there. There weren't any American, there wasn't much American support, there wasn't much British, French, you name it, Arab support, international support, what I would call sort of phase 4 in diplomacy and economics after you change out a government. And we had this duly elected, democratically elected president who was left there all alone without any ability to build institutions. And so guess what happens? The militias fill the void.
So so in Libya, what it seems like you're saying is that once you make the decision to go in and upend a government, you got a responsibility to stay and see through that transition. Can I then take it that in Iraq, part of the problem that we're dealing with today is that we left too soon?
I certainly, I think in hindsight, there is a view that if we'd left some number of forces there, that this wouldn't have happened. I'm not completely, I can't be completely certain of that. Maliki, who we handpicked, by the way, Maliki is a very, very tough character, and he is very, very sectarian and a very difficult guy to deal with.
You've had personal dealings?
Yes.
Tell us about them a little bit.
Huh?
Tell us about them a little bit.
He's a very hard guy to deal with.
Okay. On a scale of 1 to 10, where would you put Maliki?
He's right up there.
He's right up there.
Right up there. And it doesn't get better in time.
Karzai worse?
Karzai is about the same. I mean, these are two pretty difficult individuals to deal with, who we had a lot to do with being put in place.
Because we have a surprise. We have them backstage, and we're going to bring them. We're going to let you interview them.
But when I think, and this is a Western view, or something I've learned, when I think about, let's say, Maliki and Karzai, one of the things I learned in these wars is Westerners don't have a clue about what it means to wake up every single day in one of these countries and think about one thing, which is how I live through the day. The Middle East is about survival. And for us, and I'm not saying, because that's not a thought that has entered our head in the countries in which we live. And I'm not criticizing us for that, but I think we have to have that understanding as we approach somebody like Karzai. Believe me, Karzai's mental image is the picture of Najibullah hanging from a lamppost in Afghanistan after he left office many years ago. He does not want to repeat that situation. Maliki is a survivor, obviously, came from a very small party, and he will do everything he can to survive. So that's got to just be integrated into our approach on how we support them. And I still think in the end that you can make a huge difference in these countries, as hard as it is, if you can have an economic input. We talked briefly just before this about a good friend, although I didn't know him early, in Dick Holbrooke. And Holbrooke, I got to know him in Afghanistan in particular. Holbrooke and I were very much in sync in how do you impact the development, economic development issues inside Afghanistan. And you don't have to raise Afghanistan's economy, which is one of the worst in the world, very much to have them think and have an impact on the citizens, on the 30 million plus citizens in that country, which was once a rich, fertile ground for agriculture. You can't, and then one other part, particularly in Afghanistan, just because I think I like to talk a little about lessons learned. We're awful in America about lessons learned. We're forward thinking, we just move on. And we really need to study and catalog and categorize the lessons from the last 12 years. And if we're not, if leaders don't force this, we will forget those that, in fact, we should remember as we move forward in the world. And a big one, and it's resident in both these countries, but particularly Afghanistan, is the whole issue of corruption. The way we approach corruption in the future cannot be as we have done it in the past. And the Afghan people know that Karzai's government is extraordinarily corrupt. We show up to say to the Afghan people, we're here to help. They look at us and say, are you kidding me? You're supporting this group who's absolutely stripping us bare, and we're supposed to think you're here for us. Because the issue of corruption is so much more visible and so much and more transparent in the information age in which we exist. I'm not saying we need to, I'm not naive enough to think we can do away with all corruption, but it must be a part of our calculus. When Nigeria popped the other day with this hostage taking, these young girls, one of the one-liners in one of the stories was, and oh, by the way, there's $20 billion missing that's gone out of the oil business somewhere inside this government. And Nigeria is an important ally, an important friend, obviously important in the energy world as well. I just think we've got to approach it differently than we have in the past.
You talked about lessons learned. I remember last year very vividly, or last year 2 years ago, Hussein Haqqani, we both know, former Pakistani ambassador, dissident ambassador in a way, to the United States, said on this stage that America is the only country in which the expression "that's history" means that's irrelevant. Yeah. But the question is, so we've been in this for 13 years. Are our policymakers today in the White House, in the Defense Department, do they have any better idea of what the Middle East is like and what motivates people in the Middle East than we did on September 10th, 2001?
Oh, I think we have a much richer understanding of.
Do we have a strategy?
But I'm not going to say that understanding has translated to a strategy.
Can you tell us what the American strategy to deal with terrorism and the related problems of Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, et cetera? What is the strategy?
No,
today?
I can't. I can't.
You can't because you don't want to, or you can't because there is none?
So I'll just use, I use a really important example, and that's Syria. Syria was, for about the last year I was chairman, was really starting to bubble. And focus was turning towards Syria. Obviously, in early 2011, Egypt sucked up an awful lot of the bandwidth of everybody on the Middle East. But Syria in particular, I don't support military intervention there. Didn't when it first came up. And a colleague of mine, I've gotten to know, Anne-Marie Slaughter, who's here on another panel right now, she and I have debated this a couple times. And I approach it from the point of view that I want the political leaders and that are focused on this region. So it needs to be our president, Hollande, Cameron, Putin, Netanyahu, Abdullah, Erdogan, whoever's running Egypt, and I guess now it's Sisi, and then controversially, we make a decision or we have a discussion about whether we involve Nasrallah, and Netanyahu should be involved, whether we involve Nasrallah, who leads Hezbollah, and whether we involve Khamenei in Iran, or Rouhani, who's obviously out in front right now. And I want the politicians to get together and say, we got to stop the killing and we got to get the refugees home. Then give direction to their governments, figure out the policy to do this, have the diplomats do the work. Now I have a strategy. It's not perfect. And then, oh, by the way, the military needs to do this inside that strategy, as opposed to my view of what was going on when we were talking about striking in Syria is let's hit them with the military and then we'll figure it out. Nobody could tell me that whatever we did militarily, we weren't going to set the conditions for another 100,000 deaths, another 1 million refugees. That question needs to be answered. And I am tired. I am tired in the military of being the instrument that we use for these problems without all the other hard work that needs to be done inside a strategy.
Let me push back on that, because that's an important point. But let me go against the obvious sentiment of the audience for a second, and
you want me to walk off?
And now? Ask you this, yeah. While I end up like Najibullah on the top of my thing. But let me go against that and ask you this question. So it's 3 years ago. You have a moderate Syrian rebellion. It's domestic. It's not these Al Qaeda affiliated guys coming from all over the place. They are rebelling against oppression. against a really despotic guy who's an absolutist, who has his back against the wall. Tell me what the State Department could have done better than Defense Department advisors to this rebellion. Because I understand what you're saying, that you want to take the diplomacy tool out of the drawer,
Yeah.
but how do you negotiate with Bashar al-Assad?
But I mean, you could ask the same question right now. Because we haven't done enough of this from a strategic positioning or strategic view, we're in another one of, it gets worse and worse, and we don't know what to do. Therefore, and we almost, in diplomacy and policy and even politics, aren't going to work, so we'll use the one instrument we have left. I would argue that we cannot, and this goes to Putin and Russia, we are not going to be able to solve Syria without Putin and Russia. We are not going to be able to solve Iran without Putin and Russia. And we've got to figure out a way, and it doesn't have to be that President Obama and President Putin love each other. They don't, we know that. But there are relationships in the countries, even when personally we have individuals who may not think very kindly of each other, others who can make things work.
But wouldn't it be morally egregious at this moment in history to go form an alliance with Putin against jihadism 2 months after Putin invaded a member state of the United Nations and now permanently occupying it?
I think that's just too clean a cut at what needs to be done. And the alliance term is really an interesting term for me, and because I want to come to that on another issue. It needs to be certainly an agreement. It's not going to be an alliance like we have with Japan or we have with South Korea or other allies. That to me that's an alliance. But to be able to have negotiations with another country that is a big mover in a country where we have common interests, we have negotiating room with Russia, and it centers on energy. It centers on counterterrorism. They're petrified that part of Syria and Iraq is going to become, first of all, it is ungoverned space, and it will become a hub for terrorists to just go right up that spine, right up to Chechnya. And they are petrified of that. We have opportunities to work with them, and I think we need to do that. That, to me, is far from an alliance. The other place I hear alliance all the time now, and it really baffles me, is in this discussion about nuclear weapons with Iran. All of a sudden, we are trying to establish an alliance with Iran. I couldn't disagree with that more. We are negotiating with them about this incredibly bad threat, the potential that it holds, and we'll see how all that goes. But it is far from, quote unquote, an alliance. It's almost as if, like so many other words these days, that word immediately gets politicized or put in the political discussion, and we're seen all of a sudden as friends with Iran. It's a long time. Before we're going to be friends with the Iranian leadership. They are a bad bunch of guys who will continue to, in my view, first of all, survive as an administration, and secondly, destabilize the Middle East.
We're going to go to questions in just a minute, but let me go to this Iran question and ask you and frame it this way. I've dealt with you most on the issues of Pakistan, and I want you to give me, I'm going to present you a binary. Which country is more dangerous to the United States, Pakistan or Iran?
Good question.
Thank you.
Good question.
If you'd like me to vamp for time, I can.
I guess the way I'd say it is, in the here and now, probably Pakistan, because
they're an ally.
We're true, true, and but we don't have an alliance with them.
Yes,
okay,
I got it.
Pakistan, and many of you know, I made 25, 6, 7 trips to Pakistan, and part of that is, I think my background as a naval officer, I've been engaging in countries around the world. I believe in relationships. I believe in trying to establish a modicum of trust to deal with individuals. I had that with Kiani in Pakistan. I actually had it with Makarov in Russia, even though we had widely divergent views on how things should be. But Pakistan, we are negotiating with Iran so that they don't get a nuclear weapon, because that would be incredibly destabilizing in that part of the world, and I think globally. And it would engender, I believe, it would engender an arms race that would cost the world an awful lot more than even we think it would right now. But we've got a country that is not very stable, has very weak leadership, is very corrupt, and has got an internal terrorist threat and is generating terrorists externally in Pakistan. And oh, by the way, they've already got a significant number of nuclear weapons. So, and I spent enough time there to be mostly comfortable that they've got good control on these weapons. It is the crown jewel for the Pak military, specifically with respect to their relationship with India. My own belief is that India's got to focus on this. I actually was really encouraged when I saw Modi invite and Sharif accept the invitation to Modi's first day as president, to his ceremony. I'm very encouraged by that. I think the key to that is Kashmir. You've got to unlock Kashmir. That unlocks a whole lot of potential. But I also don't underestimate, and I've learned this both in my engagement with Paks and Indians, as well as some readings about their history, is you cannot underestimate how much they hate each other. And Americans have a struggle with that. I didn't understand what hate was until you get into the Balkans, you get into the Middle East, you get into these kinds of relationships. So leaders have to lead, and I hope, as Singh in India had this on his list, he could just never get to it. I hope Modi can.
One final thing, the day or the night of the bin Laden raid.
Yeah.
The helicopters crossed the border from Pakistan back into Afghanistan. You've told me once that was when your job began in some ways that night. You pick up the phone, you call General Kiani, with whom you've had a semi-functional, semi-dysfunctional, but very intense relationship. Tell us about that night and the way you explained that to them.
That was your description of our relationship.
Yes, that was my description of your relationship.
It was, first of all, just that picture, and it is iconic, and I understand. People ask me, well, what was it like? I mean, in particular, the expression on the president's face. I mean, it was unbelievably intense.
At what moment in the raid was that picture taken?
I actually don't know the answer to that. I honestly don't know the answer to that. And people ask me, well, when did you sort of realize what had happened? Clearly, that was at some point during the raid. And I've got a couple dozen people in a sovereign country with the most wanted criminal on earth, and they're not invited, and I got to get them out. So I've got to fly them back out. I've got to get the body not just into Afghanistan, but positively ID it. We did that. Then I've got to put them on a Marine Osprey helicopter, fly him through Pakistani airspace. That takes a couple hours. Get him out to an aircraft carrier, bury him consistent with his religion, and that was hours later. Then we had this debate about, first of all, who's going to talk to Kiani.
Were they drawing straws? I mean, you're drawing straws or something? Yeah.
No.
Everybody knew it was you, right?
No. It got to the point where it's obvious it was going to be me. So I call him. Now, I had met with him. Again, I just chose to do this as part of my how I lead, to engage in that country. In fact, Tony Zinni, who's a friend of mine, said when I was the CNO, he said, "You ever been to Pakistan?" I said, "No." He said, "You need to go." I went once with Deborah to visit my CNO counterpart in April of '06, I think. In April, I mean, the flowers are out. We're in Islamabad. It's nothing but gorgeous time of year, and I'm going to myself, well, this country can't be that bad. Obviously, I didn't have that right, and I was dealing with the Navy, and they actually have a good Navy. But from the time I started to visit Kiani, I made it very clear, and this was when I was working for President Bush. I said, there's not a president of the United States that if they find bin Laden is here or Zawahiri is here, they're coming. And there's nothing that's going to stop them. And that was a very clear understanding he and I had from day one. So when I talked to him...
You talked to him after the Osprey had come back over Pakistan with the body?
Yeah, we were out.
Because everybody was out.
We were out. Yeah, because, I mean, they're scrambling their jets trying to find us. And it was just, we knew enough about it at that point where that danger had passed. And we'd gotten through all those phases, if you will. So I spoke with him, and
do you just call? I mean, do you have an aide call him? Do you have his direct cell? What do you do?
Somebody.
No, I'm just curious. I mean,
No.
we don't know the mechanics of how you reach the Army Chief of Staff in Pakistan in the middle of the night to tell him that, oh, by the way, I just killed bin Laden in your country.
You call him at his house, is what you
Okay.
do. Because, but we also
never knew.
I mean, we knew because we could see what was happening in the media inside Pakistan, that something was going on. They didn't know what it was. I mean, we knew this wasn't going to last long. And in fact, it was. I mean, one of the things that Kiani, and he's a very savvy guy, he says, please get it out. Get the president to announce it. So at least he had a story of what happened into which he could then figure out how he was going to explain himself. He had the worst week of his military career the week after that, because it was pretty embarrassing to the Pac Mill for lots of reasons. And I'll just tell you the human side of this, it certainly belies belief in many ways, but I can tell you his human reaction on the other end of the phone when I spoke to him that night is he basically didn't know he was there. And there has been.
You believe that?
Huh?
You believe that?
That's the human side. Yeah, I mean, again, I'm conflicted here because although we honestly, now I'm almost 3 years out of office, we honestly had no smoking gun. One, we didn't have a smoking gun. We knew bin Laden was there, which gets back to a pretty courageous decision on the part of the president. And secondly, we have to this day no smoking gun that validates that the ISI in particular was taking care of bin Laden. And I think work is still going on to figure that out.
But Kiani was surprised.
He acted surprised.
All right. Let's go to questions. We have mics on two sides. That guy got his hand up very quickly. Let's go there. Is there anybody?
Secretary Gates in his book was very concerned about the short-term and long-term equipping of the military. How in this budget crunch situation have we solved those problems of short-term and the long-term?
So I think key to that, and a budget cycle budget cycles just have their drumbeat and they go on. The leaders now, in my view, have to figure out what capabilities we need for the future. Part of that is, what have we learned? And as distasteful or as politicized as the phrase nation building is, I believe we are not going to go into conflict in the future without doing some of that. We clearly can't be an all-coin force. We have to look more broadly, particularly with the evolution of the capabilities in China and how we're going to deal with that and being involved in stability in that part of the world. And I do worry, quite frankly, that the Korean Peninsula could go up tomorrow in a much more dramatic way than a lot of people realize, because North Korea is being led by a pretty clever, and some people believe more clever than we thought, 30 or 31-year-old with a really bad legacy to uphold. And if you just look at what he's done inside North Korea, killing his family, taking the military out of the equation, consolidating power in a pretty short period of time, I'm very worried about that. So what capabilities do we need? What have we learned? And we're developing capabilities right now. We're paying for capabilities that are going to deliver in the next 5 years. And you almost can't stop that. So we talk about 2024. We've sort of got the military that we're going to have to fight with in 2024. There'll be some fine-tuning of that. So that's really key. Secondly, it happens after every war, and it goes back to the strategy in the Middle East. We want to come home after war. We have a tendency to isolate after war, but this isn't 46 or 72 or 92. This is a world that isn't going to go away. So we just have to come home very carefully. My own view is our ground forces get smaller. We engage with our air forces and our Navy globally, stay out there, and we size our military ground force, and this mostly means the Army, in a way to respond. Gates also said, I don't know if he put it in the book, because I haven't read the book. I still haven't read a Washington book. Part of that's just my DNA, because I can't stand the books, quite frankly. but Gates.
Ladies and gentlemen, Hillary Clinton coming on stage. Right, yeah.
I can't. So Gates famously said the next SecDef or the next president would be nuts to put another 100,000 somewhere.
Invade a country, a land war.
That's all okay. I get the intellectual desire here, but we have since Grenada we have batted we're a perfect 0-0-0 in batting average about predicting where we would go to fight and how long it would take. So we need to, I think, have that 100,000 capability. Back to my own view now, what didn't happen in 2003 when we went into Iraq, I think we need to have a military appropriately sized so that the next time the President of the United States has to make a decision about whether we go to war or not, there has to be included in that discussion a fierce debate with the American people. That did not happen in Iraq. And people will probably say, well, it was 60% or 70% approval. It went to about 20 the moment the intel failed. And we didn't get to that. We didn't have enough of a debate to get to that fact that the intel wasn't right. And the American people didn't have to buy into these wars. We've got a force that is less than 1% of the American people. It's the first time we've fought like this in an all-volunteer force. They are exquisite, the best we've ever had. But the next time a president does it, I would argue, I would like a situation where we have to call up 500,000 American kids and parents all over the country from every background and every economic stratosphere, every economic level are in the debate, and the president gets to a point and says, yes, I'm going to do that. That's a whole lot different. So that gets back to what I said earlier. That's the politics of all this, and I think that debate has to occur before we go to war again. I want the military to be strong enough to start that, but not big enough to just sort of do it on our own. That we need to actually somehow, and is this a draft? I'm not sure. Probably it is, or something like that, to get America in if we're going to go to war in the future.
Tom, yeah.
So we have two main instruments for foreign policy, diplomacy and military. And I get where both of those reside. Can you hear me? Yeah. What role can economic development, and there I mean growth and prosperity in those countries, play in our foreign policy? And do we have an institution that can provide that tool to the president?
Part of what I've learned more lately than earlier in my career is that the State Department and the State Department and its budget, there are no constituents in any district in the country that the State Department is tied to. So and there's this huge debate right now about what the budget should be. And I'm a budget guy in my background, I would argue it needs to be expanded to give the State Department the tools it needs to create the kind of economic development that is required. And if we got it right in a country, it will actually overwhelm the military requirement and the diplomatic requirement, because it will raise standards of living in those countries. It will create jobs in those countries, and the instability that is resident in so many places, I would argue, would be significantly reduced. I was involved. Ann Patterson is a good friend of mine. She was ambassador in Pakistan. She subsequently was the ambassador in Egypt. And as Egypt was going in the revolution in 2011, and she was in town before she went out as ambassador, she was working hard to raise $100 million for the economic, or 150, for the economic development of Egypt. And that is a pittance compared to what we spend coming out of certainly the military bucket. We have a way of not being able to spend what is preventative. We'd rather spend a whole lot more once we get in a fight. And that's what's got to be turned on its head, and it's going to take aggressive leadership to create that kind of outcome.
Yes, over here, and then we'll go over there, down there. Yes.
Sure.
If you can stand up, that'd be great.
Sure. Going into the thousands you mentioned, what's being done and how effective are we being in countering violent extremism and taking care of that issue, because the ideology and how young the recruitment is in places in Africa, et cetera. What are we doing there?
There is a lot being done now because the numbers are up. Although it is, and very controversially right now, will be this $500 million to give weapons to groups inside Syria. But it is, I think, that the debate that focuses that is you're not really sure. And I think that's an accurate reflection of it is difficult to sort who's who in the zoo in these groups and who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. That said, I believe that you've got to take some risk associated with that if you're going to give anybody that can give you some help a chance, a fighting chance. So I know there's a lot going on. A lot of it's classified, if you will. There would be those, and I'd have a tendency to agree with them, that we're sort of late to need here. But that said, we have to do something. So there has been for many months now a very significant focus on trying to figure out a way to help in Syria in ways that we heretofore have not been able to do. And we're not in this alone either. I mean, that's really a key. Other countries are helping.
I want to come to Jane in one second, but you just prompted, I guess I got this bone in my teeth. I want to keep going at it. The president 3 years, over the past months has said, you know, I couldn't have helped 3 years ago because we were dealing with a bunch of farmers and carpenters. 3 days ago, they announced that they're going to give essentially $500 million to these farmers and carpenters to go help them. So, I mean, do you agree with him that the rebellion was hopeless 3 years ago, that these were farmers and carpenters who weren't going to be capable of doing the things that we now want them to do?
I honestly am not certain of the groups that we were talking about 3 years ago. That said, I'm trying to think of a farmer or a carpenter that I have seen in the last 10 years that wasn't carrying an AK in that part of the world. I mean, and young ones.
No, that's a very good answer. Yes, Jane.
Yeah, one of the things Mike Mullen did not mention was that while he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he also asked a group of military guys to think about a new narrative for the United States, one we could project so we could win the argument with a lot of young kids trying to decide whether to strap on suicide vests. But my question is about a word that has not been mentioned, Congress. I know, don't hiss yet. Another dysfunctional organization, but it's really a positive question. You dealt with Congress for years, Mike, for better or worse. What do you suggest could be done now to make Congress an actor in all this that could be helpful as we think about the right size military budget and the right strategies?
I actually dealt with Congress since the mid-90s, and because we are the military, it was a very bipartisan group in the Armed Services Committees and in the Appropriations Committees for Defense. And while they certainly had their differences, it was very rare that partisanship sort of broke out across military issues. And so I would proffer that we could put this up as an example. That's a part of it. I was really struck a couple weeks ago when I saw the poll, and I think it was Pew, I may have that wrong, that talked about the number of, and I hope I can say this correctly, but the number of moderate Republicans who are actually further to the left than the center of the Democratic Party, and the number of moderate Democrats that were further to the right than the center of the Republican Party. And those numbers in the last 10 years, I think, or 15 years have gone from in the 30% to down to like single digits, 7, 8, 9%, which is just a continuing reflection of the polarization. I don't have a great answer for how do you get out of this polarization. It takes leaders to do that. I'm a big believer in leadership, and it takes, actually, in my view, it takes leaders to lead these days against the polls. Because if you are, in many cases, for the good of the country, if you are strictly driven by the polls, you are not going to, clearly, based on just what is empirical evidence, we're not going to get much done. So we have to figure out how to do that. I think in the mid-'80s, because the military needed this, we passed something called, we didn't pass, Congress passed, in a very, very prescient way, this Goldwater-Nichols Act. We became much more joint. What really drove us to jointness were these two wars, quite frankly.
Explain jointness for one
Jointness is where all the services actually work together as opposed to work against each other, trying to look like we're working together. And it's a worry, it's the budget worry right now, is that we actually pull apart because we have become an extraordinarily supportive force. And that willingness to work together gets energized with a sense of urgency when young men and women are dying. The barriers fall down. How do we create that kind of sense of urgency when we're out of war at a time where we're developing capabilities for the future is part of the challenge as well. I'm not, Deb and I spent a lot of time on veterans issues and their families. So I tried, when I was chairman, to pick off members of Congress that were involved in my committees as well as the Veterans Affairs committees because I thought the system was so broken. That structure is a very old structure. It is not joint. It doesn't work across committees very well. The only way you can do that, I think, is leaders have to generate that, to generate what I would call bipartisan solutions, whether it's for the defense or VA or for the State Department as well. I thought that when Secretary Clinton came in, Gates, Clinton, and myself testified in front of each other's committees. That was to send a pretty strong signal that we were together as a team as opposed to working at cross purposes. So I don't, and then lastly I said, and this isn't news to anybody, but I certainly watched it in execution. The politics of leading these days has moved significantly down the road. And I don't know if it's an absolute significance, meaning in the Obama administration, whether it is unto themselves or whether it has been evolutionary. I suspect it has been evolutionary. And that's not to pin the rose on anybody, but it has evolved, certainly in my adult life over the last 20 plus years, from the Clinton administration to the Bush administration to the Obama administration. And in the end, the politics of it, this is Mike Mullen's view, has hurt us from getting at the substance of what we need to do for the country.
I could do another 8 or 10 hours, but we got to give up the tent. So I want to thank Admiral
Thanks.
Mullen for a great presentation. That was really great, really great.